Today I am going to be teaching you guys about the Bataan Death March. Before I get started, I would just like to say that there are a few gruesome experiences that I share that may be upsetting and probably should be upsetting. So, when American and Filipino armies were defeated on the Bataan Peninsula on April 9, 1942, the Japanese led their Allied prisoners on a brutal march to prisoner of war camps. Helpless Americans marched under the eyes of the Japanese oppressor, and the Filipinos wept in sympathy as they watched. An army of about 75,000 men were compelled to march some 65 miles from Mariveles on the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula to the railhead of Capas. Here they are loaded onto trains for another 30 miles, then walked the remaining 7 miles to their destination, Camp O'Donnell. The entire journey was 5 to 10 days, depending on when the men joined the march. About 4% of the U.S. force captured in Bataan died on the walk. The rest were prisoners for another 3.5 years, with many more deaths. Before the march, there was the war. The invasion of the Philippines started on the day after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Japan captured Manila, which forced the American and Filipinos to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. Here, they did all that they could. The light tanks of the PTG patrolled Bataan beaches. They used guns like 150mm cannons or 240mm howitzers. Now, I was going to play this short clip where survivor James Bollock from the Bataan Death March talks about before the march, but I cannot get it to work, so instead I'll be playing the audio.
I joined in 1940, August 23rd, 1940, and I joined at Barksdale Air Base. We were immediately shipped overseas. We left San Francisco in two ships. One carried our airplanes, and the other one carried our troops. We arrived we left on November 1st, arrived in the Philippines on November 20th, and 4 months later, I was a POW. Most people remember that Pearl Harbor was bombed early one Sunday morning, which meant that it was still nighttime in the Philippines. But when the sun came up in the Philippines, 9.5 hours later, here came the Japanese bombers and their fighting planes. And would you believe that just like they caught all of our ships at Pearl Harbor, in the harbor, and sunk most of them, would you believe that they caught all of our airplanes on the ground, destroying most of them? And there were thousands of American troops and also about 32,000 Filipino troops.
This is a sketch of the Bataan Peninsula battle area. The sketch was found in the Bataan Diary of Major Achilles C. Tisdale. Leading up to the march, in March, about a month before the defeat, the military situation on Bataan deteriorated rapidly. The American and Filipino soldiers were on 1/3 to 1/2 rations. They had inadequate supplies and ammunition, and they were completely exhausted and lacked air support. On March 28th, it was reported that the enemy blockade was preventing the movement of supplies to Bataan, and there were only enough food to feed the troops on 1/3 rations until April 15th. After that, they would starve to death. They were eating anything edible, even bugs. With this fact, General MacArthur came up with a plan that would help the Bataan forces to fight their way out of the peninsula, but before any plan actually went through, the Japanese began an attack on April 3rd. This made any sort of plan impossible. On the 8th, General King threw everything they had into the attack without success. This is a picture of American soldiers on Bataan listening to news broadcasts during their last days of fighting. With the possibility of surrendering, General King made a list of instructions to be given to the Japanese commander. It consisted of where and when to meet, as well as consideration for the sick troops, who may be caught in the crossfire, as well as civilians. They made contact with the Japanese commander. Colonel Williams and Major Hurt were sent. The Japanese kept Colonel Williams as a hostage and sent Major Hurt back to get General King. Hours later, General King arrived with James V. Collier, along with aides whom left in jeeps for the enemy lines. The result of this meeting ended with the surrender. Colonel Collier and Major Hurt were sent back to headquarters with a Japanese officer to pass the news. Of course, before the Japanese could get to them, General King's orders were to destroy all of their arms, ammunition, equipment, and money. So much money that these men were mind-boggled. Captain Sorensen had stated, "Don't let the Japs get the money." This would be the first time in U.S. history that a whole army had to surrender to an enemy. Same as the first clip, I could not get the video to play, so I will be playing the audio.
People ate monkeys, they ate snakes, they ate lizards, and ate just about anything that they could find. Essentially, what we were living on was a slice of bread made out of rice flour, covered with a gravy made out of water and rice flour. So we were essentially starving to death. After our front lines broke, everybody was told to report back or fall back to the tip of the peninsula at a place called Camp Cabin. And once we got there, that's when we were told that we were being surrendered and for everybody to destroy all of their arms and ammunition, which is what we did. They lined us up, they counted us, and then started us out on what is now known as the Death March.
This is a picture of General King being interrogated by the Japanese shortly after the surrender. Alongside him is Colonel Williams, Major Cothran, and Major Tisdale. On March 21st of 1942, General Wainwright was promoted to lieutenant general and designated as the commander. General Reed was his chief of staff, and on the same day General King was assigned to the Luksan force, which consisted of all the Bataan troops, or about 75,000 men. This here is General MacArthur and Major. As I have already previously mentioned, Major Tisdale wrote the diary of where I found a lot of my information from, as well as the map sketch. Other important figures whom are not pictured are Colonel Williams, Major Hurt, and Major Cothran. This is General Homo Masaharu. He was the Japanese commander in charge of the imperial forces during the battles. Susumu Morioka was a lieutenant general, as well as Kinyo Kiriyama and Nagano Kimichiro, whom I could not find a picture of. The Bataan Peninsula is in the Philippines. During World War II, the Philippines was United States territory. After the war, it gained its independence. The picture on the right shows the path that the 75,000 men had to walk, and the picture on the left shows where they battled in Bataan. The Bataan Death March has been remembered as a tragedy. The Japanese rounded the men up in groups of 100. There were 4 guards for every group. As I had previously said, the walk was about 85 miles long. The prisoners suffered through many conditions, with the weather, which could range from extreme heat to rain, as well as the beating and abuse they had to deal with. Prisoners were beaten, killed, and beheaded, as well as other horrific torture for any small thing, including falling behind, all while being starved and dehydrated. They were given very little food or water for the days on the march. The Japanese would laugh at their pain and even beat them for no reason. They would make the prisoners dig graves and bury them alive. They couldn't escape because none of them were well enough to even try. The Japanese killed 7,000 to 10,000 men during the march, but there were no records to know the exact number. The march started on April 10th of 1942 and lasted for about a week.
There's only one road out, and the minute we started marching out of that one road with guards on either sides of us, that's when we started running into the Japanese troops that we'd been fighting for 4 months. And of course, the first thing they did was they stole everything we had. They took our wallets, they took our Anybody that had a ring, they took our ring. They took our dog tags, and they emptied our musette bags on the ground and picked out whatever they wanted. And then uh, once they'd taken everything that we had, and as we kept going through these frontline Japanese troops, that's when they began to beat us. They beat us with rifle butts. They beat us with sabers. They beat us with clubs and anything they could get their hands on. And anybody that had a helmet, steel helmet on their heads, they knocked it off with a rifle butt. And that went on all day long. And even though we went by numerous artesian wells, water coming out of a 4-inch pipe, constantly flowing, no more than 20, 25 feet from the road. They wouldn't let anybody have a drink, nor did we. They let us rest. Of course, they didn't feed us. We did stop that first night, and they surrounded us with guards with machine guns, but didn't give us water, didn't give us food, but at least we were getting rest. Next day, they got us up at the crack of dawn, and we started out on the same road, again running into Japanese troops, and once again, day two was just like day one, constantly being beaten every time we ran across the Japanese. And then I think it was around the middle of the second day that people began to collapse. We hadn't had water in a day and a half, and in the tropics, it's almost beyond what you can take.
These are just some pictures I wanted to include, the animation of the walk, as well as an actual picture from the walk, and then this news article from April 24th of 1942. During the march, the prisoners had passed through San Fernando. A diary of a Filipino who saw them wrote, "To others who have not seen what I saw, I congratulate them because they have been spared of the agony and sleepless nights. To me, my wife and children, we who have seen the faces and the way they asked are something that we could not forget." Food shortages was one of the main causes of the men's low combat efficiency. It had lowered their efficiency by more than 75% during the final weeks of campaign. The men were receiving 1,000 calories a day. This was only one-third of what they should have been consuming. Feeding the troops on Bataan was a challenge. The trained cooks even had a hard time. It got to the point where they had to kill their own horses and mules so that they could feed on them. At one point they had a monkey named Toho who would hang around and people would feed him scraps, until one day the monkey was gone. After Miss Hatchett, one of the nurses, asked around, she had found out that some of the men had to eat Toho. In the picture shown to the right, American prisoners of war in the Philippines are carrying their comrades who fell from the lack of food and water along the way.
Food was nothing but a handful of cooked rice a day, and when they didn't give us rice, they gave us boiled carrot tops, not the carrots, but the tops, which we couldn't eat because they were too bitter. And they also gave us boiled sweet potato vines that were edible and probably a lot better than the rice that we were getting. And the barracks that we stayed in was nothing but made out of bamboo with a thatched roof, no doors, no windows.
In different towns they had walked through, the citizens would throw them food. Rice cakes, fried chicken, pieces of sugarcane, watermelon, and other foods wrapped in banana leaves. Of course, the Japanese would attempt to stop them, but this did not stop the exchanges. The citizens would give them as much water as they could while unsupervised, and they would leave jugs of water along the route. When the Japanese saw the exchanges, punishment was brought upon the citizens. This is the point of my presentation where it gets a little gruesome. Alf Larson had said, "The bodies jumped around like chickens with their heads cut off. Blood squirted from their necks all over me and the guards. The hands, arms, legs twitched and contracted until finally only a feeble jerk remained. The women were beaten and raped. There were decomposing bodies that were obviously sexually assaulted." I had read about an 18-year-old girl. She was gang raped by 7 Japanese soldiers as she was minding her business watching clothes by a river. She was buried alive with just her head above the ground. Another woman, whom was pregnant, was caught giving the prisoners food. The Japanese gouged out her fetus with a bayonet. A bayonet is the dagger-like weapon attached to the end of the gun, as seen in the picture to the left. One soldier can recall a woman dragging herself with her hands. Her legs were broken, her hair was partly ripped out in a mess, and her dress was torn. There were even cases of people being burned alive from trying to give the soldiers food.
Then I think it was around the middle of the second day that people began to collapse. We hadn't had water in a day and a half, and in the tropics, it's almost beyond what you can take. And of course, once anybody collapsed, the Japanese immediately killed them, and it looked like the Japanese were really trying to kill us all. It took me 5.5 days to get to the first camp.
This is a picture of American and Filipino soldiers resting during the march. Malaria and intestinal disease were 2 of the highest causes of a low combat efficiency during the battle and when the men were captured. Malaria is transmitted by the bite of a mosquito. The symptoms usually include chills, fever, and sweating. If it is not treated properly, it could cause kidney failure, seizures, mental confusion, coma, and possible death. Malaria accounted for many casualties. By April 1st, the disease will kill about 1,000 men daily. The men had many vitamin and mineral deficiencies, which caused more diseases such as beriberi, pellagra, rickets, and scurvy. Because of the lack of nutrients, the men's hair, nails, eyes, feet, teeth, nerves, and genitals all suffered. And of course, there would have been so much more loss if it weren't for the nurses that stuck by their side. These nurses also were sick and lost husbands, brothers, and fathers. The nurses did as much as they could while being weak from lack of food. They even made mosquito nets out of gauze. After some time, some of the nurses were taken as prisoners and threatened with guns if they tried to escape. They were put into small cells and were unable to help the men. After a while, they were released, but had to sign a paper that would keep them loyal to the Japanese government. These nurses were able to leave. They finally had whole meals, but in their hearts, they were still hurting thinking about how they had to leave behind the prisoners of war. But for the most part, many of the nurses had left on buses before the Japanese soldiers got to the surrender in Bataan. It was an order by General King. Many of the men who survived the march ended up dying in the boxcars to Kappas because they were so crowded and suffocating. There were 100 men in each boxcar with the door shut. There was no room for sitting, so the men had to stand for what I believe is 30 miles and about 3 to 4 hours. The men that couldn't fit into the trains walked the rest of the way. The Japanese took the soldiers off the train at Kappas, and they walked about 7 miles to Camp O'Donnell. Here, they all waited in line to drink some water from a single tap for hours. By the time the march came to an end, about 10,000 American prisoners had been murdered or escaped. The picture to the right of the boxcar, not the animation, but just the picture, is one of the actual boxcars that the men had to ride in. You can see how small it is for 100 men, and it sits on display as a commemorative marker. They arrived at the camps in October of 1942, and 2 months into the camps, 1,600 Americans and 16,000 Filipinos died of starvation, disease, or the brutality of the Japanese soldiers. When they first arrived, they were forced to stand in the burning sun for 2 hours while they built a platform by the gates so that the Japanese commandant could stand on it and be above everybody else. He gave a long speech and thought of the prisoners of war as nothing. One survivor asserted that the raw brutality exhibited by Japanese soldiers, it is incomprehensible and can only be explained by the existence of evil. It was said that in the camps, Americans died like flies. They had to endure beating and remain starving, disease, gnawing anxiety, and despair. They left little room for any Japanese or Filipino behavior. Conditions were much worse in the camps than on the march. There were very little water and no good bath to get clean. The men died at a rate of about 45 a day between the American and Filipino men for 3.5 years. They would stay in huts with no floor and a great amount of dust. The huts each contained about 150 to 200 men. When they went to sleep each night, they didn't know who would or wouldn't wake up, and they usually would only get about 3 hours of sleep. There was no room for sitting, so the men that would die standing up, and sometimes the guards wouldn't let them remove the dead bodies. There's actually a case of a compassionate Japanese guard, whom as he was walking by dying prisoners, he dropped a banana leaf and kept walking. He didn't say anything, and in the banana leaf was rice and some medicine used to treat malaria, but this was not a common occurrence. The men had to work every day. Some examples of work they did was working at a Japanese steel mill, unloading iron ore and magnesium from the docks. Another one is digging 3-foot graves. The camp was originally intended for 10,000 men, but they squeezed in 60,000. It was built in 1940 to train Filipino youth. While in the camps, some men were transferred to different places, but for the most part, most of them stayed in Camp O'Donnell.
And then the Japanese commander got up and laid down the rules of the camp and said that if any were broken, the person would be shot, which is words that we expected to hear. And but finally, he was speaking through an interpreter. An interpreter said that you have come here to die, and I thought that was a pretty severe statement. It didn't take us long to realize he was telling the truth because nobody knows exactly how many people died on the march. Americans for the Filipinos, it was in the thousands. The Americans, the numbers vary from as low as 800 or 900 to as many as 2,000. And but within the first 40 days of our being in the first camp, Camp O'Donnell, another 1,800 Americans died, and that's an average of 45 a day. And all we were doing was burying the dead. And I remember looking around and deciding that the way people were dying, within a few weeks we would all be dead. Within the first 3 or 4 weeks, we had 3 guys that escaped. It's hard to call it escaped because all we had around the camp was, at that time, was barbed wire with Japanese guards walking around to make sure nobody got out. So it was fairly easy to get out if you wanted to in the dark. So 3 guys tried it. But instead of getting caught going out looking for food, and I don't even know if they ever got any, they were caught coming back in. And of course they were tortured for a couple of days. They were put in a cage near the entrance to the camp. And then 2 days later, late one evening, everybody was called out to watch them where they'd already dug their graves, and they were executed by the Japanese. and a thousand to a hole. There was a hole in front, and a hole in back, and we were cramped like sardines. At night, they would close the hole. It was completely dark, and they'd be crying and screaming and praying, and invariably in the morning when the Japanese would open up the hole, there'd be one or two POWs that died. And we'd just hand them up to the Japanese, and the Japanese would throw them overboard. And finally, things got so bad in the boat that we finally stopped at Taiwan, Korea. They took us off the boat, hosed us down. Now that was about 7 months from the time that we had surrendered, and we were still in the same clothes that we surrendered with. And that was the first water we had on our bodies in all that length of time. We got back on the ship in our clothes, in our wet clothes. The ship was dripping wet, and unfortunately, I came down with pneumonia. We were on that ship for 32 days, and finally it docked. And instead of docking at Japan, it docked at Busan, Korea. They'd gone all the way up to Mukden, Manchuria, one of the coldest places in the world. And that's where I stayed until the war ended. But finally, you heard that the war was ending. An armistice had been signed.
Only one-third of Bataan defenders survived. The prisoners that were still alive in the camp were rescued by Allies after they retook the Philippines. I think that an interesting fact about this is that during the campaign to liberate the Philippines, American soldier John McKinney single-handedly fought off 100 Japanese soldiers and became a war hero. He received the Medal of Honor. By the time their liberation came, the mortality of the group had been 40% compared to the 4% when they reached Camp O'Donnell, and more died after their liberation from health complications from their time in the camp. All of the men were under 100 pounds by the time they were rescued. At the end of World War II, General Homo Masaharu was charged with responsibility for the march and the keeping of prisoners at Camp O'Donnell. He was charged with 43 crimes, and he was executed by the firing squad on April 3, 1946. In 1948, an American military commission tried Major General Yoshitaka Kawane and Colonel Kurataro Hirano. Both of them were executed by hanging. After some of the prisoners of war returned home, they had no money, but it didn't seem to be too much of a problem. If they were wearing their uniform, it was most likely known that they were prisoners of war, so they could hardly ever buy their own drinks. People bought their drinks for them, or the taxis would drive them around. They reconnected with their friends and family. Unfortunately, there were cases of which their girlfriends had gone off and found a new man. The Bataan Death March wouldn't be public knowledge until about 2 years later. No one really knew how bad their conditions were, and some did not even believe them. This will be the last audio clip I played.
Between the fighting parties, I was on my way home. I stopped in Crowley, which was the nearest town to where I lived. Decided I would get a haircut because I wanted to look good after being away for so long. And I stopped at this barber shop. There's only this one barber. And he began cutting my hair and started talking about this family that lived at a certain place. And as he described the place, to me, that sounded exactly where I was from. He said there were 4 boys in the Army. 2 had been killed in World War II. He said one was a prisoner of the Japanese, and he said the other was in the Navy getting ready to invade Japan. And right off the bat, I knew that he was talking about my family, and that's how I found out that my 2 older brothers had been killed. and I never did tell the barber that I was that POW. And so you can imagine what it was like when I got home. It wasn't a happy occasion that I'd been looking forward to for all those months and years, because my poor mother was just in tears, and I could tell that it wasn't tears of happiness, but tears of sorrow, because she knew that two of us weren't going to come home. In fact, until she saw me, she said that she always thought that I was also dead, but they were afraid to tell her, because she said it would have probably killed her. Now, I like to end by talking about the atomic bomb, because a lot of people thought that the Japanese were probably already beaten and there was no reason to drop the atomic bomb on them. But right toward the end of the war, the Japanese High Command had put out a directive that went to all of the POW camps. It said that the minute they hear or learn that the American landed on Japanese soil, the commander was to kill all of the POWs that they had, under their control. They could shoot him, they could drown him, they could poison him to make sure that not a single one survived. And there was no doubt in my mind that had we not dropped that atomic bomb and had we invaded Japan, not a single POW would have gotten home. And of course, that includes me.
In 1989, New Mexico State University started a Bataan Memorial Death March. Now, about 9,600 marchers come together and march either a 14-mile or 26-mile course to honor those who died during the Bataan March. Some people march in honor of a family member or a particular veteran who was in the march or taken as a prisoner of war. Walt Straka was the last Bataan Death March survivor. He passed away in 2021 at the age of 101. I wanted to share some facts from World War II that did not necessarily relate to the Bataan Death March. An estimated 60 million lives were killed during World War II. Japanese soldier Hiro Onoda hid in the jungles of the Philippines until 1974 because he did not believe that war was over. President George H. W. Bush's allies, who saved him during an air raid over Japan, were tortured, killed, and some were even eaten by Japanese soldiers. A literal Syrian brown bear became a private in the Polish corps. He carried heavy ammunition boxes mixed with the men and regularly drank beer in the evenings. After the war, he would live in the Edinburgh Zoo. Hitler and his right-hand man, Hermann Göring, were addicted to drugs. Most of the days, Hitler was high on various opiates and cocaine that were prescribed to him. Hermann was addicted to morphine. Thank you so much for watching and paying attention. I really enjoyed researching this topic, as even though it is really sad and was hard to read about, it was definitely something that I feel a lot of people should know about because of how bad it was. After this project, I've gained so much more knowledge on the Bataan Death March, and again, I apologize for the video error, but I feel as if the audio was just as resourceful. The first journal article I found on JSTOR is where I got a lot of the information of the torturing the prisoners of war had to endure. The stories of the women being tortured by the Japanese soldiers I found in this journal. This second journal, also from JSTOR, had information from my nurse's slide. This third journal provided my information about the monkey Toho, as well as other information about their food shortages, the amount they'd consume, and the order for the nurses to leave right after the surrender. This diary of Major Achilles C. Tisdale gave me quite a bit of information. It provided me with pictures, numbers and dates, the situation of the military in March, a month before the surrender, and moments during and after the surrender. These other sources here gave me a good collection of little details and such. And this bottom one here gave me all I needed to know about what happened to the Japanese generals after World War II. This is the first book I used. It provided me with information from the battle on Bataan to the aftermath of being in the camps. This is the second book. It gave me information of before the march, during the march, as well as all the people involved. Thanks again for watching.